Theresa May has been meeting opposition leaders and MPs as she tries to navigate a path out of the deadlock over Brexit. But Jeremy Corbyn is urging Labour not to engage with the Prime Minister, saying she must first rule out the possibility of no deal. France is stepping up its preparations for a disorderly Brexit, saying a chaotic outcome is growing ever more likely. There are renewed doubts about the future of nuclear energy in the UK after Hitachi suspended work on a new power station at Wilver in North Wales. President Trump has unveiled a new missile defence strategy, promising to use space-based technology to protect America from emerging threats as well as traditional adversaries. The Duke of Edinburgh has been involved in a road traffic accident but is unhurt. Also in the programme, the protests about bread that have shaken the 30-year rule of one of Africa's most ruthless leaders. Theresa May has spent the day meeting party leaders and senior MPs at Downing Street as she tries to resolve the paralysis at Westminster caused by Brexit. Mrs May is due to give a statement in the Commons on Monday, but the government announced today that the debate and vote on her alternative plan wouldn't be until the 29th of January. Jeremy Corbyn dismissed the ongoing talks as a stunt and insisted he wouldn't take part unless no deal was ruled out. Separately, the senior Tory MP, Nick Bowles, says he's received widespread support for a motion that would force the government to delay Britain's departure if a new deal failed to emerge. Here's our assistant political editor, Norman Smith.
All day, different groups of MPs, both government and opposition, Remainers and Brexiteers, have been trooping in to see the Prime Minister. A number of senior cabinet ministers, including the Environment Secretary Michael Gove and the Brexit Secretary Stephen Barclay, have also been involved in separate discussions to win over critical MPs. There is, however, little sign of any breakthrough. This morning, this was the response of the Green Party MP Caroline Lucas after her meeting with the Prime Minister.
I'm not convinced that she is willing to loosen any of the red lines she set for herself. She still thinks that it's going to be possible to be able to tweak this deal sufficiently to be able to get the 230 MPs who voted against it to swing behind it. I remain pretty sceptical about that, and that's why I think she will have to come back and look at that issue of the people's vote again.
And at a speech in Hastings, the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn reiterated his opposition to taking part in talks unless Mrs May ruled out no deal. Mr Corbyn, who was criticised by the former Prime Minister Tony Blair for boycotting the talks at a moment of national crisis, dismissed them as a stunt.
Take no deal off the table now, please, Prime Minister. And if she won't accept the will of Parliament to take no deal off the table, the Prime Minister would enter into phony talks just to run down the clock.
In a separate development, the government announced today it was pushing back the vote on Mrs May's Brexit statement to January the 29th, a move which will fuel the suspicion of Mr Corbyn and others that the Prime Minister is seeking to delay the process to intensify the pressure on those MPs fearful of a no-deal Brexit. A charge rejected by the Tory party chairman Brandon Lewis, who insisted the government was genuine in seeking to reach a consensus.
We want to have a proper conversation about some of the details that they want to see. Parliament's been very clear in that vote of what it doesn't want. We've got to get to the bottom of what it does want in a way that we can deliver with the European Union.
Meanwhile, the government has been warned some ministers outside the cabinet will resign if Mrs May seeks to thwart backbench efforts to delay Brexit. The senior Tory MP Nick Bowles told the Political Thinking podcast he had received widespread cross-party support for an amendment to force the Prime Minister to extend Article 50 if she's not secured a Brexit deal by the end of February.
We now have signatories to the amendment from 5 different political parties, and we have had indications, that many ministers, including cabinet ministers, are very, very keen to see it pass and are telling the Prime Minister that they will not vote against it.
The difficulty facing Mrs May's opponents, however, is that there's little agreement among them. The Prime Minister, on the other hand, at least appears to have a clear plan, even if to many it seems to amount to little more than wearing down her critics while the clock ticks on towards March the 29th and Brexit Day.
The Prime Minister has written to Jeremy Corbyn insisting that it isn't within the government's power to rule out a no-deal Brexit. Mrs May also says her door is still open to him. But the Labour leader has sent a letter to his own MPs urging them not to enter into dialogue with Mrs May. More details from our political correspondent, Ian Watson.
The advice to Labour MPs is contained in a bulky briefing which includes a copy of Mr Corbyn's speech in Hastings and his letter to the Prime Minister ruling out talks unless she changes position. Mr Corbyn advises his entire parliamentary party, and not just his shadow ministers, to refrain from engagement with the government until no deal is taken off the table. One shadow minister has made clear privately that he doesn't expect the Prime Minister to do so at this stage, so he's planning to have an informal chat with his opposite number. Another said he couldn't help feeling that Mr Corbyn had made a mistake, as the public wouldn't understand why he wasn't pushing Labour's position in direct talks with Downing Street. The Labour backbencher Mike Gapes went rather further on the World at One. He said his leader doesn't usually put preconditions on controversial discussions.
He's been quite happy in the past to meet with Hamas and Hezbollah and President Assad and the Iranians without preconditions. And I can't see why he has this precondition. He can then go in and argue robustly against the no deal and set out his position.
Several Labour MPs have engaged in talks, including the former frontbenchers Hilary Benn and Yvette Cooper. Emerging from Downing Street this afternoon, they both said that they, like Mr Corbyn, had urged the Prime Minister to rule out no deal. I'm told the Labour leader is likely to back cross-party moves to delay our departure from the EU if that's the only way to avoid a no-deal scenario.
The French government has given details of its plans for a no-deal Brexit. The Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe, said 50 million euros was being invested in ports and airports. Several other countries, including Germany, have said they're stepping up contingency measures. From Paris, Lucy Williamson.
The French Prime Minister said the prospect of a no-deal Brexit was becoming less and less unlikely, and that there were strong fears it would happen. Outlining the government's plan to prepare for a hard Brexit, Mr Philippe said almost 600 staff would be deployed at French ports to manage the extra checks that would be needed, and warned there could be longer queues to enter the country.
To cope with a no-deal Brexit, we've made a decision to launch a €50 million investment plan for French ports and airports, which are obviously the areas most affected by the changes that have to be brought about, taking into account a hard Brexit. This €50 million investment will be launched in the coming days.
The plan, which staff have reportedly been working on since April, will also cover the rules for British citizens and companies in France. The country's Europe Minister, Nathalie Loiseau, told the BBC that France was preparing for a no deal because, in her words, we had a Brexit by accident, and we could well have a no deal by accident too. Elsewhere in Europe, Germany has said it will also step up preparations for a disorderly Brexit while doing everything it can to avoid it. And Portugal has confirmed that British tourists won't need a visa to travel there in the event of a no-deal scenario, and that Britons living in Portugal will keep their residency rights.
The Japanese company Hitachi has shelved plans to build a £20 billion nuclear power station in North Wales after failing to reach an agreement on funding. Thousands of potential jobs are now unlikely to be created at the plant on Anglesey. The Business Secretary, Greg Clark, told MPs that the government had been willing to take a one-third stake in the project, but that any more would not have been value for money for the taxpayer. Thomas Morgan reports from Anglesey.
The power plant's proposed site, Anglesey, is the poorest county in Wales. It needs jobs and economic investment. The construction of this plant alone would have created work for almost 9,000. However, today's decision will see 400 staff lose their jobs, with work for a further 1,000 outside contract workers coming to an end in March. Local council leaders here describe Wilfa Newydd as a once-in-a-generation opportunity, something they've been holding out for. And Wales as a whole was due to benefit economically to the tune of almost £6 billion, according to independent research. The Japanese company Hitachi had already committed investment in the future here in the form of trainees and apprentices. Sasha Wynne Davis, the head of strategic development, still has faith in a new nuclear power plant.
Clearly, it's a significant blow to the economy of North Anglesey, Anglesey and North Wales. But we are suspended, we haven't finished, and there is still a door open to UK government, and those discussions, albeit very difficult, they are continuing.
Despite the optimism, questions are now being asked about the future of this project. Does Wilvernewydd have any realistic prospect of being built at all?
The electronics company Philips has announced plans to close its factory at Glemsford in Suffolk next year, putting 430 jobs at risk. Operations at the site, which makes baby bottles, will be transferred to the Netherlands. Last year, Philips warned that a no-deal Brexit would be a serious threat to the competitiveness of the Suffolk plant. President Trump has confirmed American intentions to boost the country's military defense program. The Missile Defense Review proposes to use new technology and space-based weaponry with sensors that can detect and track incoming missiles, including so-called hypersonic ones. Speaking from the Pentagon, Mr. Trump said the goal was simple: to detect and destroy any missile launched against the United States, anywhere, anytime, any place. Our correspondent Rajini Vaidyanathan reports.
In a dimly lit room at the Pentagon, President Trump painted a dark picture of the growing threats facing America today. He spoke of how countries such as Russia, China, Iran and North Korea are increasing their military capabilities and are developing new kinds of long-range missiles to target the US mainland. To counter this, he said America needs to develop and invest in cutting-edge technology.
Our strategy is grounded in one overriding objective: to detect and destroy every type of missile attack against any American target, whether before or after launch. When it comes to defending America, we will not take any chances. We will only take action.
That action includes plans for 20 new ground-based interceptors in Alaska to detect foreign attacks, as well as a space-based missile defence layer, which could destroy enemy warheads in the skies. But it comes at a price tag. Mr. Trump also used his speech to once again criticise fellow members of NATO for failing to pay their fair share. This comes ahead of a possible second summit between the US and North Korea, a country today's Missile Defense Review cites as an ongoing and extraordinary threat.
Donald Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, has denied ever saying there was no collusion between Mr. Trump's 2016 presidential election campaign and Russia. In a CNN interview, the former New York mayor insisted he only ever knew that President Trump was not involved. Here's our North America editor, John Sopel.
The one phrase used more than any other by Donald Trump in the last 2 years would almost certainly be, there was no collusion. In speeches, on Twitter, in interviews, the president has repeated the no collusion with the Russians line again and again. But last night on TV, the president's personal lawyer, former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani, contradicted that. I never said there was no collusion between the campaign or between people in the campaign. That is a massive change and is bound to interest the special counsel Robert Mueller, who's investigating this. But Mr. Giuliani has issued a statement today saying those comments were misinterpreted. He said there'd never been collusion between Moscow and Donald Trump, and with regards to the campaign, he said he had no knowledge of that. Meanwhile, the president's former lawyer, Michael Cohen, has confirmed a report in the Wall Street Journal that he paid the owner of a technology firm thousands of dollars to manipulate 2 online polls in favour of his client during the campaign. Mr. Cohen said he did this at the direction of and for the sole benefit of Donald Trump. There's been no comment from the White House.
The jury in the trial of a pilot accused of killing 11 men when his plane crashed during the Shoreham Air Show in 2015 has been shown a video of the final seconds of the flight. The Hawker Hunter jet came down on the A27 in Sussex after Andrew Hill attempted an aerial manoeuvre. He denies manslaughter through gross negligence. From the Old Bailey, here's our Home Affairs correspondent, Tom Simons.
The Hawker Hunter crash was filmed from every angle, but the pilot Andrew Hill, who flew fast jets for the RAF and airliners for British Airways, also installed 2 cameras inside his aircraft. The resulting footage showed the plane turning towards Shoreham Airport for a manoeuvre known as a bent loop, then climbing, turning left and upside down. The prosecution says Mr Hill should have realised he was too low and aborted, but instead he continued, and within seconds his view was filled by the busy road below, and then a fireball as he crashed. Andrew Hill was seriously injured and has no memory of the crash, but his barrister told the court the manoeuvre was flown so poorly he must have been incapacitated by loss of blood from the brain caused by the extreme forces of the aerobatics. However, in the cockpit video, he appears to move his head. He denies 11 charges of manslaughter.
You're listening to the 6 o'clock news on BBC Radio 4. The main news so far. The Prime Minister has been pursuing dialogue across the political spectrum as she seeks to find a way forward on Brexit. But Jeremy Corbyn is urging Labour not to engage until she rules out the possibility of no deal. The government says it's still committed to nuclear as part of the UK's energy mix, despite the suspension of a multi-billion-pound power project on Anglesey. Still to come, it's one of Britain's most successful brands. So why is the Premier League struggling to find a new chief executive? The Duke of Edinburgh was involved in a car accident near the Sandringham estate in Norfolk this afternoon. A statement from Buckingham Palace said Prince Philip, who's 97, was unhurt. This report from our royal correspondent, Johnny Diamond.
Buckingham Palace says that the Duke was driving one of the vehicles involved in the accident when the collision occurred. The Duke, the Palace says, is not injured and, whilst he has seen a doctor, has not required any medical treatment. A photo of what appears to be the accident shows a Range Rover on its side. Local police were called to the scene of the accident. The Duke is 5 months shy of 98. Last year he had a hip replacement and he was last seen in public at the wedding of his granddaughter, Princess Eugenie.
Police in Sudan have carried out mass arrests and fired tear gas to disperse anti-government protesters in the capital Khartoum. At least 20 people have been killed during a month of disturbances. The demonstrators are seeking the removal of President Omar al-Bashir, who's led the country for 3 decades, but is wanted on genocide charges by the International Criminal Court. Our Africa correspondent Andrew Harding reports on the growing unrest.
This is a dangerous thing to do in Sudan. But in recent weeks, more and more members of the public are daring to take to the streets and to defy their own government. This protest today in Khartoum was led by doctors, lawyers and other professionals chanting freedom, peace, justice. More than 1,000 people have been arrested since the protests began in December, but initial anger about the rise in the price of bread is starting to look more like a nationwide popular uprising. The security forces have used live ammunition to quell some protests. In Khartoum today, they use tear gas. But public defiance continues to grow. A failing economy is at the heart of it. The south of Sudan split away in 2011, taking with it the lion's share of vast oil revenues. An authoritarian government in the north is now struggling to balance its books and to quell public anger over soaring inflation, long queues and systematic repression.
An investigative journalist who helped expose corruption in Ghana's National Football Association has been shot dead near his home. Ahmed Hussein-Suale had contributed to BBC documentaries and was a key member of the private investigations team of an award-winning journalist, Anas Aremeyaw Anas. His murder took place a few months after a politician called for retribution against him. More details have emerged about a British SAS soldier who helped Kenyan forces deal with an attack on a hotel complex in Nairobi on Tuesday, which killed 21 people. The man, who was off-duty, was one of the first at the scene, armed and wearing a balaclava. He helped civilians leave the complex, carrying at least one wounded man out, and was later seen guiding Kenyan troops into a building. New rules are to be introduced requiring police involved in shootings or deaths in custody to be kept separate from each other so that evidence can't be contaminated. The guidance, approved by the Home Office, is part of a wider review ordered by David Cameron when he was Prime Minister. Here's our Home Affairs correspondent, Danny Shaw.
In December 2015, after police in Paris had confronted gunmen during a terror attack, David Cameron instructed officials to examine whether the legal protection for armed officers in England and Wales needed strengthening. Police were concerned they could find themselves on trial for murder, as a firearms officer had been that year. The review has led to new advice for prosecutors making charging decisions to consider the dynamic and fast-evolving situations police face. But the Independent Office for Police Conduct has also issued fresh guidance to bolster the integrity of police evidence after someone dies or is seriously injured following contact with officers. In future, police will have to be separated until they've given their account of events. If that's not possible and officers have to stay together, body cameras could be used to record their conversations.
New NHS figures for England suggest some winter pressure is beginning to build on the health service. In the first full week of January, hospitals had to close their doors to ambulances 38 times. There's also been a rise in the number of flu cases, and they're expected to rise more substantially as the cold weather arrives. Here's our health correspondent, Jane Draper.
The 38 instances when ambulances had to be diverted compare with 6 in the same period last year. Hospitals in South Warwickshire, Stockport and York were among those affected, and most notably Worcestershire, where one of England's most troubled NHS trusts had to divert ambulances on a daily basis last week. The figures also show cases of flu and the vomiting bug norovirus are rising, although NHS England points out this is to be expected in January. Last week, more than 200 people with flu were admitted to intensive care or high dependency units, and health officials said this was having a high impact on those services. The Royal College of Nursing said hospitals were only just keeping their heads above water. NHS England warned that with temperatures set to drop, it was important for people to use the 111 number as the first port of call for non-emergencies.
A BBC News editor has gone on trial accused of breaching regulations which give lifetime anonymity to victims of sexual offences. Arif Ansari is the head of news at the BBC's Asian network. He denies the charge. From Sheffield Magistrates Court, Danny Savage reports.
In an evening broadcast in February last year, reporter Rikin Majitia named a witness who had just given evidence in a rape trial. He broadcast her real name, believing it was a pseudonym. She was listening and heard her name being read out. In her witness statement, she said she went into full meltdown, panicking and crying. To have my name given out as a victim of rape on a BBC radio station was unbelievable and made me feel sick. The mistake was realised and not repeated. The prosecution say Arif Ansari had editorial responsibility and therefore attracts liability. It accepts Mr Ansari did not know or suspect the victim's real name was in the script, but says he had good reason to suspect it might be wrong because Mr Majitia was inexperienced and earlier in the day had done what was described as a very poor broadcast on the case. Giving evidence, Mr Majitia said he was suffering from stress at the time and was deeply, deeply sorry for what happened. The district judge stressed he hadn't been charged with anything and he was a diligent journalist who's made a mistake. The trial continues tomorrow.
In the city, the 100 share index closed down 28 points at 6,835. In New York a short time ago, the Dow Jones was down 22 points at 24,185. On the currency markets against the dollar, the pound was up 0.7 cents at $1.29.3. Against the euro, the pound was up 0.7 cents at €1.13.6, making a euro worth 88 pence. A senior BBC executive has become the second person to turn down the offer of leading the Football Premier League. Tim Davie, a former acting Director General, has followed another senior media figure, Susanna Dinenage, in rejecting the role. It leaves the Premier League, which is controlled by the top 20 clubs, without a permanent chief executive to replace Richard Scudamore. Our sports editor Dan Roan considers why.
When the Premier League's former chief executive Richard Scudamore announced the end of his 19-year-long reign last summer, it was assumed there'd be no shortage of candidates for one of football's most coveted and powerful roles. However, one of the richest competitions in world sport has now been turned down not once, but twice. Last month, the surprise choice, Susanna Dinenage, a TV executive at media giants Discovery, stunned the League by pulling out 6 weeks after being appointed as Scudamore's successor. The League turned to Tim Davie, the head of BBC Studios, the corporation's commercial division, who had narrowly missed out to Dinenage. But he has now also rejected the opportunity, preferring to stay in his role. The job will come with a salary estimated at more than £2 million, so what's the problem? Scudamore is certainly a hard act to follow, having overseen unprecedented increases in the value of broadcast rights, with contracts worth billions of pounds. But with a downturn in the last domestic TV deal and audience habits shifting, potential replacements are aware that continuing future growth at the rate the League has enjoyed is unlikely. Candidates are also thought to have been put off by the power of the big clubs, who have been agitating for more of a share of the League's revenue. Scudamore was widely criticised for accepting a £5 million departure bonus, and perhaps the scrutiny that comes with such a high-profile role is also a factor. A panel led by Chelsea chairman Bruce Buck must now resume its troubled search, but after this latest setback, the League looks set to be without a permanent leader for the remainder of this season.
Tennis, and the British women's number one, Johanna Konta, has been knocked out of the Australian Open in the second round. She was beaten 6-4, 6-7, 7-5 by Gabriela Muguruza of Spain in a match lasting 2 hours and 42 minutes, which ended just after 3 o'clock in the morning. She was the last British player in the singles at Melbourne. Racecourse owners are demanding action to stop drones being flown near tracks on race days. They say the devices are filming and streaming live action to gamblers to give them a time advantage. Track officials say that amounts to theft. Sarah Teal has been investigating.
A busy meeting at Southall in Nottinghamshire last week. The horses are lined up and ready for the sixth and final race of today. But as the action is about to get underway, on the very far side of the course, you can see a drone has taken to the skies. Arena Racing Company, which owns 14 racecourses, say drones have been spotted at many of them. And they say as the broadcast rights of live action are a key part of business, they consider the filming and broadcast as theft. Greg Wood, racing correspondent at The Guardian, explains why.
The two main broadcasters in Britain are Sky Sports Racing and Racing UK. Their pictures are at least 2 seconds behind what's actually happening on the course. And if someone using a drone can see what is happening on the course before it is seen by other people who are betting and running around the country, they have a big advantage and a big incentive to make money.
Racecourse owners say they're exploring every avenue to stop the drones. But in reality, if they're being piloted from public rights of way outside racecourse land, there's little that can be done to stop them.
A sculpture depicting the McDonald's mascot, Ronald McDonald, posing as Jesus on a cross, has been taken down by a museum in Israel following violent protests. The artwork at the Haifa Museum of Art was part of an exhibition on consumerism and religion which started last summer. The protests only began last week when pictures of the sculpture were circulated on social media. Our Middle East correspondent Tom Bateman has been to the museum.
Here in the gallery space there's a notice on the wall warning about harming your feelings if you pass through a black curtain and into an exhibition called Sacred Goods. But inside, the centrepiece itself is now gone. What hung here until just a few hours ago was a life-size sculpture of Ronald McDonald hanging from a wooden cross, complete with striped red stockings and a vivid yellow vest. A clown on a crucifix. McJesus, as it was called, has brought more angst to the Holy Land. Dozens of Arab Christians protested last week. A petrol bomb was thrown at the museum here. Local church heads demanded McJesus be taken down, and last night the mayor of Haifa agreed, saying the loan of the work expired this month anyway. The row had taken a series of twists. The sculpture's Finnish creator wanted his own work pulled because he was part of a boycott movement against Israel. Then the controversial culture minister, Miri Regev, called for its removal, saying it made a mockery of Christianity. But free speech groups described the decision as a capitulation, believing the sculpture has been sacrificed to a growing climate of intolerance. McJesus is now locked away in a secure warehouse.
The headlines again. Theresa May has been meeting some opposition leaders as she tries to resolve the Brexit crisis. She's written to Jeremy Corbyn urging him to take part, but he's called the talks a stunt and urged Labour not to engage with the Prime Minister if she didn't rule out a no-deal scenario. The Duke of Edinburgh has been involved in a road accident near the Sandringham estate in Norfolk. A Buckingham Palace spokesman said Prince Philip was not injured. The Japanese company Hitachi has shelved plans to build a £20 billion nuclear power station in North Wales after failing to reach an agreement on funding. President Trump has announced plans to expand America's missile defense program, including the creation of sensors in space. BBC News.